There is a moment in naval aviation history when silence became survival. In the winter of 1943, aboard the USS Intrepid somewhere in the grey expanse of the Pacific, a young pilot named Lieutenant James Holloway made a decision that violated every protocol he had been trained to follow. As his F-6F Hellcat descended toward the carrier deck in rough seas, with fuel gauges reading near empty and hydraulics failing, he did something no instructor had ever taught him. He cut his engine seconds before touchdown. The aircraft dropped like a stone, hit the deck hard, and skidded to a halt. Holloway survived. 3 months later, the Navy would quietly begin studying why pilots who cut their engines during emergency landings had survival rates nearly triple those who kept power on until the final moment. What seemed like panic or desperation turned out to be instinct recognizing what engineering had missed. By 1944, this unorthodox technique had been incorporated into carrier doctrine, saving hundreds of lives in the final months of the Pacific War. Yet the story of how this practice emerged remains buried in declassified accident reports, maintenance logs, and the testimonies of pilots who lived long enough to explain what their bodies understood before their minds did. The Pacific Theater in 1943 was a proving ground not just for tactics, but for the fragile marriage between man and machine under conditions no peacetime engineer had anticipated. Carrier-based aircraft were designed for maximum performance in combat, but landing a fighter on a moving deck in heavy seas required a precision that left almost no margin for error. The standard approach called for maintaining engine power throughout the landing sequence, allowing pilots to execute a wave-off if the landing signal officer determined the approach was unsafe. This procedure made perfect sense on paper. In practice, it created a lethal paradox. Pilots who kept their engines running during botched landings often found themselves unable to stop before running out of deck, crashing into the barrier nets with enough forward momentum to ignite fuel tanks or crush the cockpit against steel cable. Those who survived these crashes described the horror of being trapped in a powered aircraft that refused to die, propeller still turning as flames spread from ruptured fuel lines. The official accident reports from early 1943 painted a grim picture. Of 47 documented landing accidents aboard Pacific Fleet carriers between January and March, 31 resulted in pilot fatalities. The common factor was forward momentum. Aircraft that remained under power during the final moments of a failed landing carried kinetic energy that barrier systems were never designed to absorb safely. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics studied the data and recommended reinforced barriers, modified arresting gear, and additional training for LSOs. None of these measures addressed the core problem. The aircraft themselves were too committed to forward motion, and the pilots were trained to maintain that commitment until the very last second. What no one in the engineering bureaus understood was that a handful of pilots had already begun solving the problem on their own, using a technique born not from calculation, but from the raw instinct to survive. Lieutenant Holloway was not the first to cut his engine mid-approach, but he was among the first to survive it and report what he had done. His written statement, filed 3 days after the incident and stamped for review only by his squadron commander, described the final seconds in clinical detail. At approximately 50 feet altitude, with angle of attack increasing beyond safe parameters and insufficient airspeed to execute wave-off, I made the decision to terminate engine power. The aircraft descended rapidly in a controlled stall and contacted the deck with significant vertical force but minimal forward velocity. Landing gear collapsed on impact. I sustained minor injuries, aircraft total loss but recoverable for investigation. What Holloway did not write, but would later tell investigators, was that he had seen another pilot try the same maneuver 2 weeks earlier and walk away from a landing that should have killed him. That pilot, Ensign Robert Marks, had been reprimanded for willful disregard of approach procedures and transferred to land-based duty. His technique, however, had been quietly noted by several members of his squadron. By April 1943, word of the engine cut technique had spread through informal channels among Pacific Fleet aviators. It was not discussed in ready rooms or mentioned in official briefings, but pilots talked in the moments before sleep, in the seconds after landing, in the coded language of men who understood that survival sometimes meant breaking the rules written by people who had never faced what they faced. Maintenance crews began noticing a pattern. Aircraft involved in hard landings where the engine had been shut down showed crush damage to landing gear and fuselage, but significantly less fire damage than those that had struck barriers under power. The propellers were intact. The fuel lines, though ruptured, had not been torn open by rotating engine components. The pilots, when they could be pulled from the wreckage, were more often alive. The turning point came in June 1943, when Commander William Sample, a senior aviator attached to Comerpac headquarters, requested a formal review of all carrier landing accidents over the previous 6 months. Sample had flown in the early campaigns and had lost friends to barrier crashes that seemed, in retrospect, preventable. His inquiry was not welcomed by the Bureau of Aeronautics, which saw it as an implicit criticism of approved procedures. But Sample had the ear of Admiral Mark Mitcher, and Mitcher had seen enough body bags to know that something was wrong with the way the Navy was bringing its pilots home. The review was authorized. A team of engineers, flight surgeons, and experienced carrier pilots was assembled to analyze the data without preconceptions. What they found would quietly revolutionize carrier aviation doctrine, but not before dozens more pilots paid the price for procedures that prioritized theoretical control over practical survival. The data was undeniable, but it raised a question that made commanders deeply uncomfortable. If cutting the engine mid-landing improved survival rates, why had no one in the design or training pipeline anticipated this? The answer lay in the gap between simulation and reality, between the clean variables of engineering tests and the chaos of a rolling deck in a storm with battle damage and a pilot on the edge of exhaustion. The engine cut technique worked not because it was elegant, but because it acknowledged a brutal truth. Sometimes the best way to save the machine and the man inside it was to let both fall together and trust the deck to be there when they arrived. The review board convened aboard the USS Saratoga in Pearl Harbor on June 14, 1943, in a cramped briefing room that smelled of cigarette smoke and salt air. Commander William Sample laid out 47 accident reports across a steel table, each one representing a pilot who had died or nearly died trying to land on a carrier deck. The engineers from the Bureau of Aeronautics arrived with equations and stress calculations. The flight surgeons brought data on impact tolerance and human physiology. The pilots brought something else entirely: the memory of watching friends die in fires that should never have started. For 3 days, they argued over the physics of carrier landings, the design limitations of arresting gear, and the training protocols that had been standard since before the war. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Lieutenant Commander Thomas Blackburn, a veteran of the Coral Sea and Midway campaigns, stood up and said the thing no one else had been willing to say out loud. "Gentlemen, we have been teaching our pilots to kill themselves in the name of procedure." The room went silent. Blackburn continued, "Every accident report in front of you describes a pilot who maintained engine power because that is what he was trained to do. And every one of them died, or nearly died, because the momentum carried them into barriers they could not stop against. The ones who survived cut their engines and fell. We need to stop pretending this is a failure of discipline and start admitting it is a failure of doctrine." The engineers resisted at first, as engineers often do when confronted with data that contradicts design assumptions. The F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, the TBF Avenger, all had been designed with specific landing profiles in mind, profiles that assumed continuous engine power until the moment of arrestment. Cutting the engine eliminated the possibility of a wave-off, eliminated the safety margin that allowed a pilot to abort a bad approach and come around again. But Blackburn and the other pilots in the room knew something the engineers did not. In actual combat conditions, with damaged aircraft, exhausted pilots, and decks pitching in 15-foot swells, the theoretical safety margin of a powered approach was an illusion. Most pilots who waved off did so too late, their aircraft already committed to a descent path they could not recover from with failing hydraulics or battle-damaged control surfaces. The powered wave-off, in those conditions, became a powered crash, faster, hotter, and almost always fatal. The pilots who cut their engines were not giving up control. They were surrendering the illusion of control in exchange for the reality of survival. The data Sample had compiled told a story the Navy had not wanted to hear. Of the 31 fatalities in the first quarter of 1943, 27 involved aircraft that struck barriers or overran the deck while under power. Of the 16 pilots who survived serious landing accidents during the same period, 11 had shut down their engines before impact. The correlation was too strong to ignore, but it raised uncomfortable questions about accountability. If the engine cut technique was demonstrably safer, then every pilot lost in a powered barrier crash had died following official procedure. The implications rippled through the command structure. Training protocols would need to be rewritten. Accident review boards would need to revisit their findings. Families would ask why their sons had not been taught the technique that might have saved them. The institutional instinct was to bury the data, to classify the findings and move on. But Admiral Mitchell, who had lost too many good pilots to procedural orthodoxy, made a different choice. He ordered the formation of an experimental training program to test the engine cut technique under controlled conditions and to develop doctrine that could be rolled out across the Pacific Fleet. The testing began in July 1943 at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, using a short runway designed to simulate carrier deck dimensions and equipped with portable arresting gear. Volunteer pilots, all with carrier experience, were asked to execute approaches with simulated emergencies, hydraulic failures, damaged flaps, asymmetric control surfaces. Half the approaches were flown using standard procedures, maintaining power until arrestment. The other half involved cutting the engine at varying altitudes, 100 feet, 75 feet, 50 feet, and allowing the aircraft to drop onto the deck in what amounted to a controlled crash. The results were filmed, measured, and analyzed. What emerged was a set of parameters that would later be codified into doctrine. An engine cut executed between 50 and 75 feet, with the aircraft in a nose-high attitude and at minimum controllable airspeed, resulted in a vertical descent that absorbed energy through landing gear compression rather than forward momentum into barriers. The technique required precise timing and a willingness to accept hard landings that would damage or destroy the aircraft, but it kept pilots alive. The film reels from North Island showed aircraft slamming onto the runway with landing gear collapsing, tails dragging, but no fires. The pilots walked away. In test after test, they walked away. By September 1943, the first iteration of the new doctrine had been drafted and distributed to squadron commanders in the Pacific Fleet. It was not presented as a replacement for standard procedures, but as an emergency technique to be used when a normal landing was no longer possible. The language was careful, almost apologetic. In conditions where aircraft control is compromised and arrestment uncertain, pilots may consider terminating engine power at altitude not less than 50 feet to reduce forward velocity and minimize barrier impact. The phrasing reflected the institutional discomfort with endorsing a technique that contradicted decades of training. But pilots understood what the careful language meant. If you are going to crash, crash slow. The technique spread quickly, not through official channels, but through the network of informal communication that had always existed among aviators. Pilots taught each other in ready rooms, demonstrated the timing on chalkboards, described the feel of the aircraft dropping beneath them and the moment of acceptance that came with cutting the engine. It was not a comfortable technique. It required trusting the deck to be there, trusting the landing gear to hold, trusting that a vertical impact was survivable where a horizontal one was not. But it worked, and word of its success traveled faster than any directive from headquarters. Now, te convido a deixar nos comentários de onde você está nos assistindo e o horário exato em que escuta esta história. Nos interessa saber até quais lugares e em quais momentos do dia ou da noite chegam estes relatos documentados. The resistance to the engine cut technique came not from pilots, but from the institutional Navy, from officers who saw it as an admission that carrier aviation was more dangerous than they had been willing to acknowledge. There were concerns about morale, about the signal it would send to families and to Congress that the Navy was teaching pilots to crash their aircraft as standard procedure. There were concerns about cost, about the increased rate of aircraft write-offs that would result from hard landings that destroyed landing gear and bent airframes. But most of all, there was the psychological resistance to admitting that the procedures in place since the beginning of the war had been wrong, that men had died following orders that should never have been given. Admiral Mitchell cut through the debate with a single question posed to the Bureau of Aeronautics in a memo dated October 12, 1943. Are we in the business of preserving aircraft or preserving pilots? The answer, when it finally came, was bureaucratic and evasive, but it included authorization to expand the training program and to incorporate engine cut procedures into fleet carrier qualifications. It was not an apology, but it was a recognition that survival sometimes required falling. By the end of 1943, the survival rate for serious carrier landing accidents had begun to climb. The technique was still not universally accepted. Some squadron commanders refused to teach it, some pilots refused to use it, but the data was undeniable. Pilots who cut their engines in emergency landings were 3 times more likely to walk away than those who maintained power into the barriers. The steel cables that had torn so many aircraft apart now caught machines that arrived with less momentum, less fire, less death. The sound of a carrier deck changed in those months. From the roar of engines fighting to stay airborne to the sharp crack of landing gear collapsing and the scrape of metal on wood. It was not a sound anyone wanted to hear, but it was the sound of pilots coming home alive. And in the cold mathematics of war, that was the only number that mattered. The barriers were supposed to save lives. Stretched across the carrier deck at intervals, constructed of steel cable and nylon webbing, they were designed to catch aircraft that missed the arresting wires and prevent them from crashing into the planes parked forward. In peacetime tests at shore facilities, the barriers performed exactly as engineered. They absorbed the kinetic energy of a landing aircraft, brought it to a controlled stop, and protected the deck crew and parked aircraft beyond. But peacetime tests were conducted with undamaged aircraft, rested pilots, and calm seas. In the Pacific in 1943, none of those conditions applied. The barriers became killing devices, traps that turned survivable landing errors into catastrophic fires. When an aircraft under full power hit the barriers at 70 or 80 knots, the steel cables cut through aluminum like wire through cheese, rupturing fuel tanks and igniting vapors in the engine compartment. The nylon webbing, designed to cushion impact, instead became kindling for fires that burned so hot they melted the deck plating beneath. Pilots who survived the initial impact often died trapped in cockpits, while deck crews fought flames with equipment that was never adequate for the temperatures generated by aviation fuel burning in confined spaces. The barriers saved aircraft parked forward, but they killed the men who flew the aircraft that hit them. Lieutenant Robert Chen was the first pilot to document in detail what happened when an aircraft struck the barriers under power. His report, filed after a landing accident aboard the USS Essex in August 1943, described the final seconds with the clarity of someone who had come within moments of burning alive. Chen had been returning from a combat air patrol with battle damage to his starboard aileron and fuel leaking from a punctured wing tank. His approach was high and fast, compensating for reduced control authority, and he missed all 4 arresting wires. Standard procedure called for maintaining power to attempt a bolter, a touch-and-go that would allow him to come around for another attempt. But Chen could see the barriers ahead, could calculate in the seconds he had left that his damaged aircraft would not clear them. He cut his engine. The F-6F dropped, hit the deck tail first, and slid into the barriers at perhaps 30 knots instead of 70. The impact collapsed his landing gear and tore off his propeller, but the fuel tanks remained intact. The aircraft stopped. Chen climbed out through the canopy and walked away with a sprained wrist and bruises across his chest from the shoulder harness. The deck crew later told him that if he had hit the barriers under power, they would have been pulling his body from wreckage too hot to approach. Chen's report reached Commander Sample's desk 3 days later, and Sample recognized immediately that it represented something more than a single pilot's good fortune. It was empirical proof that the engine cut technique worked not just in theory, but in the worst conditions carrier aviation could produce: battle damage, fuel leaks, compromised control surfaces, and a barrier impact that would have been fatal under standard procedures. Sample forwarded the report to Admiral Mitchell with a cover memo that was blunt even by wartime standards. "We have designed a system that kills pilots who follow procedure and saves those who violate it. Recommend immediate review of barrier engagement protocols and expansion of engine cut training to all Pacific Fleet carrier squadrons." Mitchell's response came within 24 hours. "Approved. Make it happen." By September 1943, the Navy's carrier aviation training program had been quietly revolutionized, though few outside the aviator community understood the significance of what was happening. The change was not announced in press releases or highlighted in training films. It spread through the fleet the way most real changes spread in military organizations, through the informal networks of pilots who wanted to live and commanders who wanted to bring them home. The engineering challenge was more complex than simply teaching pilots to cut their engines. The barriers themselves needed to be redesigned to account for the new reality that aircraft would be hitting them at lower speeds, but in less controlled attitudes. The original barrier design assumed aircraft would arrive level and under power. The engine cut technique produced aircraft that arrived nose high, tail low, often with landing gear already collapsed. The Navy's Bureau of Ships initiated a crash program, an unfortunate term given the context, to develop barriers that could safely arrest aircraft in these configurations without causing the catastrophic fuel ruptures that had killed so many pilots. The solution involved relocating the barrier cables lower on the support posts and adding breakaway sections that would absorb energy without cutting into fuel tanks. The redesigned barriers began appearing on Pacific Fleet carriers in October 1943, and the results were immediate. Barrier engagements that would have been fatal 6 months earlier now resulted in damaged aircraft but living pilots. The steel that had killed now merely bent and broke. It was not elegant, but it worked. But the barriers were only part of the equation. The real challenge was psychological, convincing pilots to surrender control at the moment when every instinct screamed to maintain it. The engine cut technique required accepting that the aircraft was going to crash, that the landing was beyond saving, and that the only choice left was between a slow crash and a fast one. For pilots trained to believe that they could fly their way out of any situation, this acceptance was almost impossible. The Navy's flight surgeons identified it as a variant of target fixation. Pilots would focus so intensely on trying to salvage the landing that they would not recognize the moment when salvage was no longer possible. By the time they accepted that the landing had failed, they were already into the barriers at full power, and it was too late. The solution was not more training in aircraft handling. Most of the pilots who died in barrier crashes were highly skilled, but training in decision-making under stress, in recognizing the moment when continuing to fight for control, became the decision that would kill you. The training program developed at North Island incorporated scenarios designed to force pilots to make the cut engine decision repeatedly until it became instinctive. Instructors would simulate emergencies during carrier qualification approaches, hydraulic failures, engine roughness, control surface damage. The pilots were required to assess whether the landing was salvageable, and if not, to cut the engine and accept the hard landing. The first few times, most pilots hesitated, trying to stretch their glide or nurse the aircraft down with partial power. The instructors would let them crash into the practice barriers, slowly enough to be safe, but hard enough to make the point. After 2 or 3 repetitions, something changed. The pilots stopped fighting. They would recognize the moment when the approach was lost, cut the engine without hesitation, and ride the aircraft down in a controlled fall. It was not surrender. It was a different kind of control. The control that came from accepting what could not be changed and focusing on what could. The pilots who learned this lesson at North Island carried it back to their squadrons, and the survival rate continued to climb. By November 1943, the engine cut technique had been incorporated into fleet carrier doctrine under the designation Emergency Deck Recovery Procedure Alpha. The name was deliberately bureaucratic, designed to obscure the revolutionary nature of what was being taught. Pilots simply called it the dead stick drop, and they taught it to replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific with a directness that no official manual could match. If you are going into the barriers, cut your engine at 50 feet and let it fall. You will break your airplane, but you will walk away. If you try to fly it out, you will die in fire. The message was clear, and it was repeated in ready rooms across the Pacific Fleet until it became doctrine, not because headquarters ordered it, but because pilots understood it to be true. The war did not pause for the Navy to perfect its procedures. Pilots continued to die in landing accidents, but the ratio shifted. More walked away, more came home, and the barriers slowly stopped being the last thing so many of them ever saw. The sound of a carrier deck in late 1943 was different from the sound a year earlier. There were still the crashes, still the fires, still the moments of terrible violence when metal met metal and men died in ways that were never mentioned in the letters sent home to families. But there were also the hard landings that ended with pilots climbing out of wrecked aircraft, shaken but alive, standing on a deck that had become survivable because someone had finally been willing to admit that the procedures were wrong and the pilots were right. It was not a victory anyone celebrated. It was simply the mathematics of falling, solved by men who understood that sometimes the only way to survive the landing was to stop trying to fly. The technique had a name by early 1944, though it was not the name the Navy wanted anyone to use. Officially, it was Emergency Deck Recovery Procedure Alpha. In the ready rooms and on the flight decks, pilots called it going dead, shutting down the engine and trusting gravity to bring them home. It was not a maneuver anyone wanted to execute, but it was a maneuver everyone needed to know. The pilots who survived using the technique became informal instructors, teaching replacement aviators the feel of an aircraft dropping beneath them, the moment when continued flight was no longer possible and controlled descent became the only option. These lessons were not part of the official syllabus. They happened in the minutes before launch, in the debriefs after recovery, in the half-lit spaces where pilots gathered to smoke and talk about the things they could not say in official reports. The veterans would describe the sensation. The sudden silence when the engine cut, the aircraft settling into a descent that felt like falling because it was falling, the hard slam of impact and the metallic screech of gear collapsing. They would describe the moment of acceptance that had to come before the decision, the psychological shift from fighting the aircraft to working with it in its final seconds. And they would end with the same advice, repeated like a mantra. Better to break your airplane than to burn in it. The statistics supported what the pilots already knew. By January 1944, analysis of Pacific Fleet carrier landing accidents showed a dramatic reversal in survival rates. In the first quarter of 1943, before the engine cut technique became widespread, 65% of serious landing accidents resulted in pilot fatalities. By the first quarter of 1944, that number had dropped to 22%. The difference was not in the skill of the pilots. The replacement aviators arriving in the Pacific were, if anything, less experienced than those they replaced. The difference was in what they had been taught about how to die, or rather, how not to. The pilots who cut their engines accepted the loss of the aircraft in exchange for the possibility of survival. Those who maintained power until the final moment were often fighting for both, trying to save the aircraft and themselves. And in that divided focus, they lost everything. The engine cut technique was brutal in its honesty. It acknowledged that some situations had no good outcome, only a choice between bad and worse. Lieutenant Commander Edward Rourke was one of the pilots who taught the technique most effectively, not through formal instruction, but through demonstration. Rourke had survived 3 barrier crashes using the engine cut method, each time walking away from wreckage that should have killed him. His squadron aboard the USS Bunker Hill had the lowest accident fatality rate in the Pacific Fleet, and other squadrons wanted to know why. Rourke's answer was simple. We teach our pilots to recognize when they are dead if they keep flying, and we teach them to fall while they still have altitude to work with. He developed a training routine that forced pilots to make the cut engine decision under pressure, using a marked point on the approach where they had to either commit to a standard landing or execute the dead stick drop. There was no middle ground, no trying to stretch it out and see what happened. Commit or cut. The pilots who trained under Rourke carried that binary decision-making with them to other squadrons, and the technique spread through the fleet, not because of directives from headquarters, but because pilots trusted other pilots who had survived what they might have to survive. The resistance to the technique, where it still existed, came from senior officers who had learned carrier aviation in an earlier era and could not accept that the fundamentals had changed. For them, maintaining engine power until the last possible moment was a matter of airmanship, of fighting for the aircraft until there was no fight left. Cutting the engine felt like surrender, and surrender was not part of the vocabulary they had been raised with. But the junior officers and the enlisted pilots who flew the majority of combat missions had no patience for philosophical debates about airmanship when the alternative was burning alive in a barrier crash. They learned the technique, taught it to each other, and used it when they had to. The generational divide was never formally acknowledged, but it was visible in the accident reports. Older pilots died at higher rates than younger ones, not because they lacked skill, but because they could not bring themselves to abandon the procedures that had kept them alive in an earlier war. The tactical implications of the engine cut technique extended beyond individual survival. Squadrons that adopted the method aggressively experienced lower overall aircraft loss rates, a paradox that confused the logistics officers responsible for tracking airframe availability. How could a technique that involved deliberately crashing aircraft result in fewer total losses? The answer lay in secondary effects. Pilots who knew they had a survivable option for landing emergencies were more willing to push damaged aircraft back to the carrier rather than ditching at sea, where rescue was uncertain and aircraft were always lost. They flew home on failing engines, leaking fuel, and damaged control surfaces because they trusted that even if the landing failed, they would survive the crash. This meant more aircraft recovered, more aircraft repaired, and fewer pilots lost to the ocean. The engine cut technique, intended as a last resort survival method, became a force multiplier by changing the risk calculus for damaged aircraft recovery. Pilots took chances they would not have taken before, and more often than not, those chances paid off. If essa história te surpreendeu, já deixa o like para ajudar o canal. By mid-1944, the technique had become so widespread that the Navy could no longer avoid acknowledging it officially. Training films were produced, though they were careful to present the engine cut as one option among many, rather than the preferred method for emergency landings. The film showed aircraft executing the technique in ideal conditions: clear weather, calm seas, undamaged aircraft, and the results looked almost gentle, like a controlled descent rather than a crash. The reality, as every pilot who had used the technique knew, was far more violent. But the films served their purpose. They provided official sanction for a practice that had already saved hundreds of lives and would save hundreds more before the war ended. The pilots who watched the films in training laughed at the sanitized version, but they understood what the films represented. An institution slowly, grudgingly admitting that the people doing the fighting knew better than the people writing the manuals. The psychological impact of the engine cut technique was more subtle but equally important. Pilots who survived crashes using the method often reported a sense of agency that was absent in standard barrier crashes. They had made a decision, executed it, and lived because of it. The crash was not something that happened to them, but something they controlled, even in its violence. This sense of control, even in failure, reduced the psychological trauma of serious landing accidents and allowed pilots to return to flight status more quickly. Flight surgeons noted the difference in debriefs. Pilots who had cut their engines described the experience in terms of actions taken and decisions made, while those who had maintained power into the barriers described it in terms of things that happened too fast to process. The distinction mattered. Pilots who saw themselves as active participants in their survival were more likely to continue flying effectively. Those who saw themselves as victims of circumstance often developed anxiety disorders that ended their combat careers. The engine cut technique, by providing a clear decision point and a physical action to execute, gave pilots a way to maintain psychological control in situations where physical control was already lost. By the time the war ended in August 1945, the engine cut technique had become so thoroughly integrated into carrier aviation doctrine that few pilots remembered it had ever been controversial. It was simply how you landed when the landing was going to fail. Cut the engine, hold the nose up, accept the impact, walk away. The barriers were still there, still necessary, but they had been redesigned and repositioned to account for aircraft arriving slow and tail low rather than fast and level. The survival rate for serious landing accidents had stabilized at around 75%, a dramatic improvement from the 35% of early 1943. Hundreds of pilots owed their lives to a technique that had emerged not from engineering studies or official doctrine, but from the desperate instinct of men who refused to die following procedures that were killing them. The Navy never issued an apology for the pilots lost before the technique was adopted. There was no formal acknowledgement that the procedures in place at the start of the war had been wrong, but in the maintenance logs and accident reports of late 1944 and 1945, a pattern was visible. More aircraft destroyed, fewer pilots dead. The mathematics of falling had been solved, and the solution was written in bent metal and empty cockpits, in aircraft that would never fly again, and men who would. The memo arrived at the Bureau of Aeronautics in Washington on March 3, 1944, stamped Priority Review and signed by Admiral Mark Mitcher himself. It contained 47 pages of accident data, engineering analysis, and pilot testimony, all pointing to the same conclusion. The standard carrier landing procedures developed before the war were killing pilots at a rate that could no longer be justified by operational requirements. The memo recommended immediate redesign of barrier systems, modification of arresting gear to accommodate higher sink rates, and formal incorporation of engine cut procedures into all carrier aviation training programs. It was not a suggestion. It was a demand backed by the combat commander who controlled the largest concentration of carrier air power in history. The engineers at the Bureau read the memo with a mixture of defensiveness and dawning horror. Defensiveness because the procedures being criticized were procedures they had written, tested, and certified as safe. Horror because the data made clear that those procedures had contributed to the deaths of hundreds of pilots who had done exactly what they were trained to do. The institutional response was slow, bureaucratic, and entirely predictable. The Bureau formed a committee to study the recommendations. By the time the committee issued its report 6 months later, another 73 pilots had died in carrier landing accidents, most of them in circumstances where the engine cut technique might have saved them. The committee's report, declassified in 1963, is a document of remarkable evasiveness. It acknowledges that certain modifications to existing procedures may be warranted based on operational experience, but stops short of admitting that the original procedures were fundamentally flawed. It recommends further study of barrier design and additional training for pilots in emergency landing techniques, without specifying what that training should include, or acknowledging that pilots had already developed and disseminated the techniques the committee was supposedly studying. The report's language is careful to avoid assigning blame, describing the high fatality rate in early 1943 as an unfortunate consequence of wartime operational tempo, rather than a foreseeable result of inadequate procedures and equipment. Reading the report decades later, with full knowledge of how many pilots died waiting for the Bureau to act, is an exercise in controlled rage. The engineers knew. The data was in front of them. They chose to move slowly because moving quickly would have required admitting they had been wrong, and institutional pride proved stronger than institutional conscience. The redesign of the barrier systems, when it finally happened, was incremental rather than revolutionary. The Bureau approved modifications to cable tension, support post-placement, and breakaway mechanisms, but these changes were implemented across the fleet over a period of months rather than weeks. Carriers in combat operations continued using the old barriers while waiting for refit periods when the new systems could be installed. The delay was justified on logistical grounds. The Navy could not afford to pull carriers from the front lines for modifications that might take weeks to complete. But the practical effect was that pilots continued dying in crashes that the new barriers might have made survivable. The calculus was brutal. The operational value of keeping carriers in the fight was judged to outweigh the lives that would be lost to outdated equipment. No one stated this calculus explicitly, but it was visible in the priority assignments and refit schedules. Essex-class carriers operating in the Philippine Sea kept their old barriers through the summer of 1944. Pilots kept dying. The new barriers waited in supply depots. The arresting gear modifications presented a different kind of challenge. The existing systems had been designed to safely arrest aircraft at specific approach speeds and sink rates. The engine cut technique produced arrivals well outside those parameters. Lower speeds, but much higher sink rates, as aircraft essentially fell the last 50 feet onto the deck. The arresting wires and hydraulic systems needed to absorb that vertical energy without tearing the tailhook out of the airframe or causing the aircraft to bounce back into the air. The engineering was complex, requiring changes to wire tension, hydraulic damping rates, and deck pendant design. The Bureau's engineers worked on the problem through the spring and summer of 1944, producing a modified arresting system that could handle the new landing profile. But installation required dry dock time and specialized equipment that was in short supply. The modified systems began appearing on fleet carriers in September 1944, more than a year after pilots had started using the technique that made the modifications necessary. In the interim, pilots executed dead stick drops onto decks equipped with gear that was never designed for the loads they were imposing. Landing gear collapsed. Arresting hooks tore free. Some pilots died in crashes that would have been survivable if the carrier had been equipped with the modified gear. The engineering solution existed, but the logistics of war meant it arrived too late for hundreds of men. The training modifications were easier to implement but no less contentious. The official carrier qualification syllabus was updated in June 1944 to include instruction in emergency power-off landings, though the language was carefully sanitized to avoid explicitly endorsing what pilots had been calling the dead stick drop. Instructors at training commands were given discretion in how much emphasis to place on the technique, and that discretion produced wildly inconsistent results. Some training squadrons incorporated extensive practice in engine cut landings, forcing students to demonstrate proficiency before qualifying for carrier duty. Others mentioned the technique in ground school, but provided no practical training, leaving pilots to learn it in combat conditions where mistakes were fatal. The inconsistency reflected the ongoing institutional discomfort with a technique that contradicted decades of received wisdom. Senior instructors, many of whom had learned carrier aviation in the 1930s, struggled to teach a method they did not fully accept. The result was a generation of replacement pilots who arrived in the Pacific with wildly varying levels of preparation for the one situation that might save their lives. The most damning evidence of institutional failure came from the accident review boards that investigated fatal crashes throughout 1944. Board after board found the same pattern. Pilots who maintained engine power into barrier crashes died at dramatically higher rates than those who cut engines and accepted hard landings. Board after board recommended immediate changes to training and procedure, and board after board saw those recommendations disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of the Bureau of Aeronautics, where they were studied, discussed, and ultimately diluted into suggestions for further study. The review board reports, preserved in the National Archives, show a pattern of frontline officers desperately trying to communicate the urgency of the problem to headquarters staff, who seemed unable or unwilling to act with the speed the situation demanded. The disconnect was not malicious. The engineers and administrators at the Bureau were not indifferent to pilot deaths, but it was deadly. The institution moved at institutional speed, and men died while the paperwork circulated. By late 1944, the gap between official doctrine and actual practice had become so wide that squadron commanders simply stopped waiting for headquarters approval. They trained their pilots in engine cut techniques, using whatever methods worked, filed accident reports that carefully documented the success of the technique, and ignored the official syllabus when it conflicted with keeping their pilots alive. This informal rebellion was never coordinated and never acknowledged, but it was real. The pilots knew it, the squadron commanders knew it, and eventually the Bureau knew it too, though that knowledge was never translated into the kind of sweeping policy reform that might have saved the pilots lost in the interim. The final tally would not be calculated until after the war, when historians with access to complete records could count the cost of bureaucratic caution measured in body bags and gold star telegrams sent to families who would never know that their sons had died, following procedures that other men had already proven were wrong. The engineers who designed the original systems were not villains. They had worked with the best data available in peacetime, under constraints imposed by budgets and timelines, and the assumption that carrier aviation would look roughly like it had looked in the 1930s. They could not have anticipated the operational tempo of the Pacific War, the level of battle damage pilots would routinely bring back to the carrier, or the psychological and physical exhaustion that would characterize carrier operations by 1943. But when the data came in showing that their systems were failing, when pilots and commanders screamed for changes, the engineers responded with the speed of an institution rather than the urgency of a crisis. That failure, not of engineering, but of institutional responsiveness, cost lives that should never have been lost. The steel cables and hydraulic systems eventually caught up with the reality of carrier warfare, but they arrived too late for the men who fell through the gap between what was and what should have been. The war ended on August 15, 1945, and with it ended the period of rapid, brutal innovation that had characterized carrier aviation since 1942. The fleet that steamed into Tokyo Bay in early September bore little resemblance to the fleet that had fought at Coral Sea 3 years earlier. The carriers were larger, the aircraft faster and more powerful, the pilots more experienced, but the most significant changes were not visible in the ships or the aircraft. They were written in the procedures, the training manuals, and the institutional memory of an organization that had learned slowly and at terrible cost that the men who did the fighting sometimes understood the fighting better than the men who planned it. The engine cut technique, born from desperation and refined through repetition, had become standard doctrine by war's end. No pilot graduating from carrier qualification in late 1945 would think of it as anything other than normal procedure for landing emergencies. The technique had been domesticated, bureaucratized, absorbed into the official way of doing things. But for the pilots who had been there when it was still controversial, when using it meant violating orders and risking reprimand, the technique would always carry the memory of the men who had died before someone was willing to listen. The post-war analysis of carrier landing accidents, conducted by the Naval Safety Center between 1946 and 1948, provided the statistical validation that should have been unnecessary. The data showed beyond any reasonable doubt that the introduction of engine cut procedures in 1943 and their gradual adoption across the fleet through 1944 had saved between 800 and 1,200 pilot lives. The number was calculated by comparing actual fatality rates in 1944-1945 with projected rates based on the 1942-early 1943 baseline. It was a number that represented living men who would have been dead if the Navy had not changed its procedures. It also represented a darker calculation. The men who had died in 1943 and early 1944, while the Bureau studied the problem and the modified equipment worked its way through the supply chain. Those numbers were never officially tallied, but the implication was clear in the accident data. Every month of delay had cost lives that could have been saved. The bureaucratic caution that seemed prudent in Washington had been fatal in the Pacific. The carriers themselves bore the physical evidence of the technique's adoption. By 1945, every fleet carrier in the Pacific showed the characteristic pattern of hard landings, scored deck planking from tail skids, impact marks where landing gear had collapsed, barriers torn and replaced more frequently than in earlier years. The maintenance logs documented the increased rate of aircraft write-offs due to landing accidents, a cost the Navy had been reluctant to accept in 1943, but which by 1945 was simply part of operational overhead. Aircraft were replaceable. Pilots were not. Or rather, pilots were replaceable too. The training pipeline produced thousands of them, but each pilot represented months of training, hours of flight time, and operational experience that could not be quickly replaced. An aircraft could be pushed over the side and a new one brought up from the hangar deck within hours. A pilot lost in a barrier fire represented an investment of time, resources, and knowledge that could not be recovered. The bean counters at the Bureau of Aeronautics eventually understood this calculus, though understanding came too late for the pilots who had paid the price for their initial reluctance. The technique influenced jet carrier aviation in ways that would not become apparent until the 1950s. Early jets, with their higher approach speeds and less responsive throttle systems, made the engine cut technique more dangerous, but also more necessary. The physics of falling did not change, but the margins became smaller. A jet fighter descending in a dead-stick drop had less time to correct its attitude, less room for error in the timing. The Navy's experience with the technique in World War II informed the design of jet carrier aircraft, leading to stronger landing gear, better energy absorption systems, and approach procedures that built in the possibility of engine failure at low altitude. The F-9F Panther, the F-2H Banshee, and later the F-8U Crusader all incorporated design features that made survival possible when the engine cut technique had to be used. The engineers who designed those aircraft had access to the accident data from World War II, and they used it. The lesson had been learned, though it had taken years and hundreds of lives to learn it. The pilots who survived the war using the technique carried it with them into civilian aviation. Charles Lindbergh, visiting a commercial pilot training program in 1952, was startled to hear an instructor teaching engine failure procedures that were clearly derived from carrier aviation doctrine. The instructor was a former Navy pilot who had learned the dead-stick drop in the Pacific and saw no reason why the same principle should not apply to four-engine transports approaching a runway with failed hydraulics. The technique did not translate perfectly. Commercial aircraft had different weight distributions and approach characteristics. But the underlying logic was the same. When continuation is no longer possible, stop fighting and manage the descent. The principle saved lives in commercial aviation just as it had in naval aviation, though the connection was rarely acknowledged. The institutional knowledge of how to fall safely was quietly transferred from one aviation community to another, carried by pilots who understood that survival sometimes meant surrendering control at exactly the right moment. The memorial plaques in the Naval Aviation Museum at Pensacola include names of pilots who died in carrier landing accidents between 1942 and 1945. Reading those names with knowledge of when the engine cut technique was adopted and how long it took to spread through the fleet produces a particular kind of grief. Some of those men died before anyone knew there was a better way. Others died while the better way was being studied, discussed, and slowly worked into official doctrine. And some died in the last months of the war on carriers that had not yet received the modified barriers or arresting gear, using procedures that were already obsolete but still officially sanctioned. Their deaths were not meaningless. Every combat death carries the weight of the cause it serves, but they were preventable in a way that makes them harder to accept. They died not because the enemy was too strong or the mission too dangerous, but because the institution they served was too slow to acknowledge what its own pilots had already discovered. The lesson written in bent metal and scored decking is simple but painful. Institutional knowledge is valuable, but it can also be deadly when it prevents an organization from learning from the people who face the consequences of its decisions. The pilots who developed the engine cut technique did not have engineering degrees or access to wind tunnels or computer models. They had fear, instinct, and the desperate clarity that comes from understanding you are about to die unless you do something differently. They experimented, shared what worked, and taught each other to survive. The institution eventually listened, absorbed what they had learned, and codified it into doctrine. But the listening came late, and the cost of that delay was paid by men who followed orders that should have been changed months or years before they died. The bent metal and the scored decks remain as evidence of a lesson the Navy learned the hard way. Sometimes the people doing the job know better than the people writing the manual, and the speed at which an institution recognizes that truth can be measured in lives. The carriers returned to port in late 1945 and were met with celebrations, parades, and the relief of a nation that had won the war it needed to win. The pilots who walked down the gangplanks were heroes, and they were treated as such. But in the quiet moments after the celebrations, in the officers' clubs and the empty ready rooms, there was a conversation that never made it into the newsreels or the official histories. It was a conversation about the men who had not come home, and specifically about the ones who had died not from enemy action, but from following the procedures they had been trained to follow. The engine cut technique had become so thoroughly normalized by war's end that the newer pilots did not understand how recent it was or how many men had died before it was accepted. But the veterans knew. They knew the names of pilots who had burned in barrier crashes in early 1943 before anyone had been willing to admit that the standard procedures were wrong. They knew the dates when the modified equipment had finally arrived on their carriers, months after it should have. And they knew, though they rarely spoke it aloud, that some fraction of the names on the casualty lists represented not the inevitable cost of war, but the preventable cost of institutional inertia. The official history of carrier aviation in World War II, published by the Navy in 1947, devoted exactly 2 paragraphs to the development of emergency landing procedures and made no mention of the controversy that had surrounded their adoption. The history described the engine cut technique as a valuable addition to carrier aviation safety practices developed through operational experience and incorporated into training programs by mid-1944. The language was bloodless, bureaucratic, and technically accurate. It was also a profound distortion of the truth. The technique had not been developed through operational experience in the sense of a systematic engineering study. It had been invented by desperate pilots who violated procedure to save their own lives, and it had been resisted by institutional authorities who saw it as an admission of failure. The incorporation into training programs had not happened in mid-1944, except on paper. The actual adoption had been gradual, inconsistent, and largely driven by squadron-level commanders who were tired of writing letters to the families of dead pilots. But the official history smoothed over those details, presenting a narrative of steady improvement and institutional competence that bore little resemblance to the messy, painful reality. The veterans who knew the real story mostly kept it to themselves. There was no percentage in publicly criticizing the Navy when the war had been won and the nation was ready to move on. A few pilots wrote memoirs in later years that touched on the subject, describing the technique and mentioning in passing that it had not always been accepted procedure. But the full story, the resistance from the Bureau of Aeronautics, the delay in implementing equipment modifications, the lives lost while committees studied problems that pilots had already solved, remained buried in classified accident reports and personal correspondence. The institutional memory was preserved not in official documents, but in the informal oral history passed down through generations of carrier pilots. Young aviators learning to land on carriers in the 1950s and 1960s were told by their instructors about the pilots in the Pacific who had figured out how to survive when the landing went wrong, and about the Navy's reluctance to listen. The story became a cautionary tale about the limits of institutional wisdom and the value of trusting the people who actually do the work. The families of pilots who died in barrier crashes were never told that their sons might have survived if they had used a technique that was not yet officially sanctioned at the time of their deaths. The casualty notifications spoke of heroism and sacrifice, of men who gave their lives in service to their country. These things were true, but they were not the only truth. The men who died in early 1943 following standard procedures were no less brave than the men who survived in late 1944 using the engine cut technique. They were simply unlucky in their timing, caught in the gap between what the institution knew and what the institution was willing to change. Their families received medals and folded flags and the gratitude of a nation. They did not receive an acknowledgement that their sons had died following orders that other men had already proven were deadly, or that the Navy had been slow to act on that knowledge. That acknowledgement would have raised questions the Navy was not prepared to answer, questions about accountability, about the cost of bureaucratic caution, about how many lives might have been saved if the institution had moved faster. By the 1960s, most of the pilots who had flown in the Pacific during World War II had left active service. The engine cut technique was by then so thoroughly integrated into carrier aviation that newer pilots did not think of it as anything special. It was simply what you did when the landing was failing: cut the engine, manage the descent, accept the crash. The technique had been refined over the years, supported by better equipment and more sophisticated training. Modern carriers had barriers designed specifically to catch aircraft arriving in dead-stick configuration. Arresting gear systems incorporated features that could handle the high sink rates the technique produced. Flight simulators allowed pilots to practice the maneuver repeatedly without risking actual aircraft. The technique that had once been controversial had become routine, its origins forgotten by most of the people who used it. But in the declining community of World War II carrier pilots, the memory persisted. At reunions and in letters, they would sometimes mention the pilots who had died before the Navy figured it out, the men whose names were on plaques, but whose deaths might have been prevented if someone had listened sooner. The final accounting will never be complete. The records are too fragmented, the variables too numerous, the counterfactuals too speculative. How many pilots would have survived if the engine cut technique had been officially sanctioned in early 1943 instead of mid-1944? How many deaths could have been prevented if the modified barriers and arresting gear had been prioritized for immediate installation instead of scheduled for refit periods? The numbers can be estimated, but never known with certainty. What is certain is that the technique worked, that pilots who used it survived at dramatically higher rates than those who did not, and that the Navy took more than a year to fully acknowledge and support what its pilots had discovered on their own. That delay had a cost measured in lives, and those lives deserve to be remembered not as inevitable casualties of war, but as victims of an institutional failure to adapt quickly enough to the reality its people were facing. The carriers that fought in the Pacific are mostly gone now, scrapped or sunk as targets, or preserved as museums. The aircraft they launched are in museums too, polished and pristine, bearing no trace of the hard landings and barrier crashes that characterized their operational lives. The pilots who flew them are mostly gone as well, their numbers diminishing each year. But the lesson they learned remains relevant. Institutions must be willing to learn from the people on the front lines, must be willing to change procedures that are not working, and must be willing to act with urgency when lives are at stake. The engine cut technique saved hundreds of lives in the final years of World War II. It could have saved hundreds more if the institution had moved faster, listened sooner, and been willing to admit that the procedures written in peacetime did not always apply in war. The silence after the war was a silence of relief, of exhaustion, of gratitude that the dying was over. But it was also a silence that covered uncomfortable truths about how some of that dying might have been prevented. The steel decks are quiet now. The barriers stand motionless, waiting for aircraft that will never come. And the pilots who learned to fall, who discovered that sometimes survival meant surrendering control at exactly the right moment, have mostly passed into history. Their legacy is written in the procedures that every carrier pilot still learns, in the equipment designed to make hard landings survivable, in the institutional memory that says, when the people doing the job tell you something is wrong, listen to them. Because the cost of not listening is measured in names on memorial plaques and letters to families, and the silence that falls when someone who should have come home does not. The war taught many lessons. This was one of them. It was learned slowly, painfully, and at a cost that should not have been necessary. But it was learned. And in the end, that is the best that can be said. The institution learned, and the men who came after survived because of it. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of the pilots who learned to fall in order to survive. See you in the next video.